from England, from Spain, from Canada. Canada still counts as international. We have people from all over the country. So what is started as a regional conference really now is an international conference, and that's very exciting for I hope for you. It certainly is exciting for me as well. Copies of Jamie's book are for sale out there, and he'll sign them from Libris Mobis booksellers. And one of the things that we hope to do for those of you who have books out, now that we know about the mobile booksellers, that we're going to try to do this as a regular feature for the conference every year. And as you get accepted or come, just let us know what the books are. We'll give them all the information to the booksellers, and if they can do that, and we can all sell our books. We're having a meet the authors panels afterwards. A lot of our books aren't quite out; they're coming out this year, but so you can buy them next year. We'll give you that opportunity. So we're very excited. This is a well-timed luncheon speaker, and we're very happy to have them. James McGrath Morris has been a reporter, editor, book publisher, and for maybe in some people's minds, most significantly, a high school teacher. So he's seen the world from a lot of different perspectives, and he's now in a position many of us, I'm sure, are envious of, as a full-time writer. Not his first book, but his biggest book prior to now was called The Roseman of Sing Sing, which was a biography of the city editor Charles Chapin, and it was selected by the Washington Post as the best book of the year for 2004, and was optioned for a film and released as a Random House audiobook. Why he's here today is he just this month, I believe, or at the end of last month, has released Pulitzer, A Life in Politics, Print and Power. It's the first full-length biography of Joseph Pulitzer in a long time. And early reviews are good. Jonathan Yardley in the Washington Post said it's the best biography of Pulitzer to date. One of the interesting things about Joseph Pulitzer is we all know him, we all know the prizes, he's central, but how much do we actually know about him like that? So there could be no more appropriate speaker for us. By the way, here we are in the Herald Tribune. We never really competed that much with Pulitzer, but they were somewhere else, so we'll let that. But this is the old Herald Tribune building, but to have a first look at the new scholarly work or the new biography of Joseph Pulitzer, very happy to have Jamie McGrath Morris.
Thank you. I was fortunate by the seismic disaster that's occurring in newspapers today to have my book come out at the same time. Elliot has a new book that reflects that's coming out in March, is it not? Free for All, How the Internet, or the Internet Transformation of Journalism. So it's interesting because a lot of what I've been writing about is about a previous seismic change, in the sense the birth of the modern newsprint media. And now we're watching its decline and its former buildings being the schools of journalism. You know, it's irony. I'm really grateful to have a chance to talk to you as opposed to other groups about Pulitzer, because you know journalism history. And Elliot is entirely right. When I go to bookstores and I start talking about Joe Pulitzer, they all know his name, but they know very little about him. Whereas you folks already know the major arc of his story, how he came here as an immigrant Jew from Hungary, how he built up the Post-Dispatch in St. Louis, New York World, how at the height of power he goes blind, turns into the Howard Hughes of the 19th century, which for me was great because it created an arc for me to be able to write the story. But also I'm a little anxious because I feel like I'm sitting amongst the giants of journalism history. I looked at the list over lunch, I saw Professor Kroger's name, I saw Joe Campbell's names, and you all know this story so much better than many ways than I as an interloper. But what I wanted to do was to try to answer, I think, a central question, which has to do with why another biography about Pulitzer, even though there hasn't been a major one in 40 years. And the way I phrase it is, you know, why should we care about a man who, as one reviewer rightly put it, a cruel, ruthless, self-absorbed newspaper owner became a millionaire championing the cause of the dispossessed while eager to rub elbows with the moneyed classes? And that's the question I'm going to try to answer for you today. So take you back to an early December morning, December 9th of 1878. 31-year-old Joseph Pulitzer strolled from the Lindell Hotel in St. Louis to a nearby courthouse, a Greek revival building with a cast iron dome modeled after St. Peter's basilica in Rome. This is when St. Louis was a rising city. By the time he reached the courthouse, a small crowd had already milling around the east side. Pulitzer knew just about everybody among the 30 or so men that had gathered there, and they knew him. Quote, the tall, graceful figure and pale Mephistophelian face of Mr. Joseph Pulitzer with its expression of keen irony was the object of marked attention, wrote one of the reporters present that day. And well, they should have noticed his presence. Since his arrival in St. Louis as an unemployed Civil War veteran in 1865, who had come from Hungary, had gotten into the United States by agreeing to be a mercenary soldier in the Union Army, Pulitzer had clawed his way into the elite of the St. Louis group. He'd been a politician, a lawyer, a journalist, and he'd made money in some very clever schemes, mostly newspapers. Once, for instance, he bought a dying German language newspaper and resold it the very next day for a profit. His trick was to recognize that this German paper had an AP franchise, which was very valuable in those days, and the St. Louis Globe was without one. So he bought the corporation, walked across the street to the Globe, and sold it to them, who announced the next morning that they were being published by the Staatszeitung with an AP membership, thus the right to publish these AP dispatches, and that was changing the name of the paper to the St. Louis Globe and the language from German to English. Clever corporate trick. So the crowd knew him, and they were gathered there for an auction of two bankrupt newspapers. An 8-year-old failed newspaper called the St. Louis Journal was expected to sell for less than the value of its presses, type, and furniture. Which sounds familiar today when I look at some of the cities that have been going to. Anyway, the other paper for sale that day was the 16-year-old Dispatch. It had greater potential. Despite a miserable track record, it still had a lure to a lot of newspapermen. The more reasonable men who were present that day had only modest expectations for its sale, and some had none. Asked what he would pay for the paper, newspaper publisher William Hyde replied, "I wouldn't give a damn for it." "Gentlemen," the auctioneer said, "I now propose to sell you the Evening Dispatch, a paper that will live when all other evening newspapers are dead." Laughter, of course. Then the bidding began. Pulitzer was clever enough to use another man to do the bidding because he figured if he did it, they would see that he was interested. So he just stood while this other man did the bidding, and it's a great tale, but too long to tell you today. Elliot has me under strict instructions to let you go by 4, I believe, right?
Before that, before.
Oh, before, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Anyway, he got the paper for $2,500 and had about $300 or $400 left to his name. He now owned the first newspaper that he intended to operate. He wasn't going to sell it. And he merges it quickly, as you know, with the Post. And so on the frigid December day of 1878, he begins a path that I would argue remakes American journalism. And why I start there to talk to you about this today is that the minor act of buying this bankrupt evening newspaper, when no other evening papers in St. Louis were making money, is an early example of Pulitzer's uncanny foresight. He was convinced, when no one else was, that evening papers had a great future. And it turns out, if you now, as a historian looking back, you can see the elements he was seeing as a business person at that moment. You had the advent of the telegram, the so-called Victorian internet. You had faster printing presses that made it possible to publish an afternoon paper in St. Louis with news that was as fresh as that day from Washington and New York, which made the morning papers look like they were publishing yesterday's news, which in fact they were. Urbanites, particularly workers and others, these are folks who've been, in the Industrial Revolution, who were leaving the fields and coming into cities, and they had a voracious appetite for news. They were commuting. They were getting on trolleys. They wanted something to entertain themselves. Gaslight, electric lights, also made newspapers an important pastime at the end of the day.